talked with us about a colorectal screening project. So go ahead.
All right.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? All right. I get to wear 2 microphones. That's exciting. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about a project that we did as a Lean Six Sigma Greenbelt project to help improve colorectal cancer screening in our internal medicine clinic. I'm only going to tell you a little bit about the project. My main goal today is really to engage you in the project. And so I'm going to give you some background and tell you about what our goals were, and then I've actually passed out the data that we gathered to you guys, and so I'm going to have you break into some groups, and I'll let you know when it's time to do that. And I'm going to have you brainstorm what you think the root causes of this problem are and what some potential solutions you think are. So I'll tell you what to do when it's time to do it, but my goal is to actually have you help solve our problem. So I'm going to start with a case. So this is my mom. She she's still alive, but she's a 54-year-old woman at the time who had not had colorectal cancer screening. Despite having a daughter who tries to get people to get screened for colon cancer, there were so many barriers that she had. She was concerned about the sedation. It was difficult to schedule it. She had to take time out from her busy day to do this. She had no symptoms and said, why would I, taking on the risk of a procedure when I don't have symptoms seemed like somewhat of a stretch. And so luckily, I finally convinced her to do it at age 58, and it was normal, so thank goodness, but not everyone is so lucky. And so colon cancer, the last statistics from the CDC from 2010, over 130,000 people in the US were diagnosed, and 54,000 people died from colon cancer. And colon cancer is one of these things that we can screen early for. We can find it early. We can remove these precancerous polyps, and is really one of the few things where we have strong data to say that we can actually prevent this from happening. And we know that the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force gives recommendations for screening, and they give a grade A recommendation for screening between the ages of 50 through 75 with either fecal occult blood testing, sigmoidoscopy, or colonoscopy. So why don't people get screened? We sort of talked about why my mom didn't get screened, but it's expensive. People have to take time off work. They have to get child care. It's probably the most invasive, especially with colonoscopy, the most invasive thing that we ask people to do when they're completely asymptomatic, just for prevention of disease. So it's multifaceted and it's complex. So in our primary care internal medicine clinic, we at the beginning of this project looked at our screening rate, and about 63% of the patients who should have been screened based on that U.S. Preventative Services Task Force recommendation were. So that's just a percent of how many were screened, but 37% aren't screened. And when we actually looked at those raw numbers, it was over 3,000 patients that weren't screened that might have been appropriate for screening. So if you think about a number needed to screen of about 300 to save a life potentially, I mean, there's potentially 9 people who we could save by doing this screening. So we put together a green belt project, and green belt is a Lean Six Sigma method of solving problems that are complex problems where you don't necessarily know what the root cause of these problems are. And we go through several phases: define, measure, analyze, improve, control. And so for this project, we went through all of that whole entire process. I'm not going to walk you through every step of it today, but we did go through that. So the beginning of the project is really just defining your problem and making a charter of your project. Anytime you do a QI project, this is a really great way to start, of just putting it on paper. What is the problem? So defining the problem that colorectal cancer screening rates were low in primary care, and why is it important? And I think that with the importance, you always want to tie it to the patients. I mean, there's usually a quality metric that it's also tied to, and it's good to include that, but really we don't want people to die of colon cancer because our systems weren't good enough. And then defining what the scope of your project is. This is maybe one of the most important things actually, is biting off something feasible that you can choose. So for us, we kept the scope within our own clinic to start, and within UNC to start. and then defining what it is that you want. So up here we have what defines colorectal cancer screening, and we very quickly decided to just go with the U.S. Preventative Service Task Force guideline. There are so many guidelines and recommendations out there. We picked one and we went with it, and that's how we defined that somebody had actually completed screening. We spelled out a schedule of how we were going to accomplish this, and then also who was going to be involved in the project. And then we started to really get our residents involved in this, and this is a whole lot of fun. We started to try and figure out what's the nature of this problem and just learn a lot more about it. And so Anna Conrado, who some of you may know, was an intern when she did this project, but she tried to call 65 people who we thought had not completed colorectal cancer screening just to ask them more about it. And we had sort of defined what we thought. She helped us, and we defined what we thought she should ask. She only reached 16, so you can already see a problem, right? People don't answer their phones. And the people she got a hold of, those 16, 5 had already been screened and 11 were unscreened. So these 5 we didn't know were screened, so that's another problem, right? 2 of them had upcoming colonoscopy scheduled, and quite a few of them actually requested stool cards. So just through this QI, stool cards or colonoscopy. So even just through this sort of like survey of the patients, we actually we're getting a few more patients to be screened. And then she asked them what their barriers were, and they brought up a whole lot of barriers, similar themes: transportation, cost. It was really difficult to schedule. Time, the unclear instructions of just sort of what they were supposed to do. Stool cards, the biggest thing a lot of people said was like, I never heard about stool cards. I could do this and not do a colonoscopy? That sounds great. But then some people said, that's too gross, I'm not doing that. So it could go either way. We also surveyed the providers in the clinic. We actually surveyed doctors, nurses, advanced practice providers, just to ask them if they were satisfied with the process. And they had a really long survey. This is just a little bit of it, but not a really long survey, about 1 page. But overall, most of them found it easy to order stool cards. But if you look at the bottom graph, a lot of them found it really complicated and unclear how to even order a colonoscopy. And this should be our bread and butter. We do this every day. Then we also called GI procedure. We actually brought GI procedures into the room, and we had meetings with them, and we just tried to learn a little bit more about their process, because despite the fact that we were sending them 50 to 80 colonoscopy referrals per month, we didn't really know how their processes worked. And so we learned that this was pre-Epic, but they got the order by fax, and then they would try and call the patient, and they'd try 3 times, and then a lot of times they couldn't reach the patient. And then they had this, they still do this, they have a triage questionnaire where they go through and they ask questions about medical conditions like diabetes, HIV, blood thinners, things like that, to help sort of triage how soon they need to have it, where they need to go, which site they should go, and then they schedule the patient. So they really have to call the patient. And this happens way after they leave our office to get this ball rolling. They also had a policy where if they couldn't get a hold of the patient within 30 days, they canceled the procedure. So we actually got a lot of feedback from our providers that they were like ordering the same colonoscopy over and over and over again. So then we set out to map the process, and this is a lot of fun. And it's good to do it with Post-it notes because you sort of change your mind. So we got actually in one of these rooms back here and really like covered the walls with all the steps. And that's not good, right? Like the more steps you have, the more likely things are going to fall through the cracks. And so with colonoscopy, we figured out that if everything went right, there were 75 steps for a patient to get a colonoscopy. For stool cards, if everything went right, there were 71 steps. And so then what if someone gets a stool card that's positive, and then they have to get a colonoscopy, and then they don't call within 30 days, so everything gets canceled, and then it all goes, or they try and reach them, and it all goes through around and around. That's a lot of steps, and we wonder why. We wonder how actually 63% of them actually got it done, right? So that's just a little bit of background on sort of what we learned at the beginning, and then we jumped into what's called the measure phase, where we first defined what data do we want to collect about this problem, and then tried to gather it. And we gather data several different ways from databases, but also even just from sort of hand counting and tallies. So I have passed out to you our data from the measure phase, and so just based on what I've told you so far about our project, and in your packets. Yeah. what I want you to do is sort of go around into groups around the whiteboards and spend